Shabbat shalom.
I'm telling you, bargains.
Good Shabbos. Delightful to be here. And some of you I know for many years, and some of you are familiar faces, but I don't know exactly who you are. But in any event, I'm Rabbi Sukol, and I won't remember all the names, but if we could just take a minute, just share your first name with me.
Michael.
Bijan.
Bijan, thank you. Ron.
Shira,
Ellie.
Mina, Yingli,
Harvey.
Jackie, Judy.
Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here. Josh got in touch with me, Rabbi Foster got in touch with me about coming to teach this morning and maybe working me into the rotation. And I'm not a member here, but I have a connection I've never had before, which is that my daughter and son-in-law and my two grandchildren just joined, I think in October, right after the holiday. So when you see.
Kids are very cute.
Thank you, Talia and Andy Carrot.
I met them.
She's a Sukol, but she uses carrots, Talia and Andy Carrots, and he is in the two-person adult bar bat mitzvah class, which is October 19th. Not that I'm plugging it, but should I be there?
That must be Sukol.
And then the children, yes, if you see two little blonde ones running around.
A girl and a boy, right? A girl and a boy.
Agree, yes. Estelle is my granddaughter. She goes by Stella, though I like calling her Estelle. And Gabriel, Ira, is Gabi. And they're almost in June, they'll be 3 and 2. So, and welcome to everyone online. I see there's a number of people.
Yeah, and somebody's got a thing on.
Yeah, Nelson.
So we are, yes, thank you. And I see Carol Eisenstadt without a picture and student. I don't know who that is, but we'll take it.
I do know who she is.
Uh,
Sorry, it's a Carol Willis.
Another Carol.
Carol Willis. Sorry,
So
Carol.
we are in the thick of the book of Leviticus. You do this every week, so you know kind of where we are. And we are this week Parshat Mitzorah, which in many years, by the way, we go right until 10, right? And not later. So we're all in the.
We don't turn into pumpkins.
Mitzorah is often combined with what was last week's portion, Tazria. Tazria Mitzorah is a double portion. There are 14 Torah portions that can be paired up into 7 pairs. And it depends on the vicissitudes of the Jewish calendar, what gets paired up in any given year, and how the holidays fall, and whether it's a leap year, etc. This year, as is common in most leap years, Jewish leap years that we're in right now, Tazria and Mitzorah are usually split up. And so they're, even though they really are of one piece and very much deal with the same theme, they are divided and read as 2 separate parshiot. And so this morning we're in Mitzorah, Leviticus, chapters 14 and 15. And one of the rules for the parshiot that can be paired up is they all need to be fairly short. You don't want to put 2 long portions together, because then the Torah reading would be much too long. That's called the tircha de tzibor. That's a punishment or burden for the community. And so you don't want to burden the community with an extra long. Although I think Tazria and Mitzorah together are still shorter than many of the parshiot in.
So which
Genesis.
page first?
What's that?
What page?
In Eitz Chaim 660.
What page first? Figuring out where the parshiot start and stop, or the calendar of what you're going to read.
I don't know how to answer that question.
Does it mean that in non-pregnant year, non-leap year, Tazria Mitzorah is always?
I don't think they're always together, but most of the time they will be, but I don't know that it's always, because the other thing besides the leap year that affects it, because the leap year gives us 4 extra Shabbatot, but the other thing that affects it is if certain holidays fall on Shabbos, then the holiday portion usurps the weekly parsha, and so things get moved around.
Okay,
The most, to me, forget about the dividing of the parshiyot. To me, the most amazing thing about the Jewish calendar, and we haven't had to make an adjustment in so long, is that they figured all this out by about the middle of the 4th century. You know, they basically were working with abacuses, but they figured out how to make it all work and to keep the holidays in their place. And the whole reason we have the leap year is really to keep Sukol in the fall, because it is the definition of the start of fall, and Pesach in the spring.
they call it a powerful brain.
Yeah,
That's what they call it.
yeah. So, I want to just read quickly kind of to get us into Mitzorah, and I want to put our focus on a couple of things this morning. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Thus shall be the ritual for a leper that has to be purified." Now, the interesting thing is, you know, from your studies, is that this leprosy we're talking about, first of all, today we don't call it leprosy, we call it Hansen's disease. What's being described in the Torah, any dermatologists here?
What did you say it was called?
Hansen's disease,
Hmm.
for I believe it was a British doctor, Hansen.
Never heard of that before. Hansen?
Hansen, Hanson, Hansen's disease.
Never heard of this.
Whether the leprosy of the Bible is actually what we now call Hansen's disease. I mean, part of this was an attempt to destigmatize the illnesses. You know, in modern times, I mean, as recently as COVID, we stopped calling diseases by the country that they were first discovered in, or you know, we don't like to call it the Black Plague anymore, right? So we tried to. So Hansen's disease was an attempt to destigmatize, I think either the late 19th, early 20th century, destigmatize leprosy. Whether the leprosy of the Torah is what we call Hansen's disease, who knows? It appears to be, with one big exception, which is that the leprosy in the Torah can infect not only people, but your clothes and your house. And so, you know, some home repair guys call themselves the house doctor. So maybe that's why, I don't know. But, so this shall be the ritual for a leper. And of course, we are in Leviticus. This is the guidebook, if you will, the instruction manual for the Kohanim, the priests. And they're in charge. You know that in biblical times, the role of the priest, the Kohen, and the role of the physician were kind of one.
Yeah.
Right? They functioned in that way. We have at least one physician in the room, right? As I'm looking around.
Two, actually.
Who?
Good, Bob.
Gotcha.
Bob.
Bob, hello. What kind of medicine do you
Endocrinology.
indulge in? Endocrinology. All right. Are there any endocrinological diseases we need to destigmatize? I don't know. You'll tell me.
I don't think so.
When it has been reported to the priest, he shall go outside the camp. If the priest sees that the leper has been healed of his scaly affection, the priest shall order 2 live pure bird, cedar wood, crimson stuff, and hyssop to be brought. The priest shall order one of the birds slaughtered. And then we have this whole ritual of good morning. We have this whole ritual of sacrifice of animals and taking the blood from these animals. And we're not going to go into all the details here. I just want to read this to get where I want to get to. And the blood is placed around the ridge of the right ear of the afflicted person. And on the 7th day, the afflicted person shaves off all of his hair of head, beard, and eyebrow. He washes his clothes. On the 8th day, he shall take 2 male lambs without blemish. This is a little bit like the scapegoat story that we read on Yom Kippur, also in Leviticus, not very far from this. in terms of the chapter, and, that scapegoat story, the Jewish, on Yom Kippur, the Jewish people, our sins are atoned for, but it never works out well for the lamb, right? The goat, the goat. Does not work, either one of them, right? On the 8th day, say 2 male lambs without blemish, 1 ewe lamb in its first year, so, and then we get into, this is where we get into on verse 17, I'm skipping ahead. Some of the oil left in its palm shall be put by 16. The priest shall dip his right finger in the oil that is in the palm of his left hand and sprinkle some of the oil with his finger 7 times. Some of the oil left in his palm shall be put by the priest on the ridge of the right ear of the one being purified, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. This is an elaborate ritual. First of all, we notice a right-hand bias here. You can't help but escape that. Any lefties in the room? Not leftists, lefties. Fortunate,
Wow.
5 out of what? 9, 10, 11, 12. 16, a third of the room is lefties. Very
I just happened to notice,
Yes.
that they're only talking about, the men, because everything is his beard,
Yeah.
his side curls.
Yeah.
So does this not apply to women?
I think that would be an incorrect conclusion to come to. I think the better conclusion is that regrettably, this text, I think the nicest thing we can say about it from this vantage is that it's patriarchal. I have other students who study with me would say, don't be afraid to call it sexist. Just call it what it is. This is the orientation of the Torah over and over again.
Many times it will say men and women. It will indicate.
Right, well, when it says that, it means the women were included. In
So I'm
chapter
just
18 of
curious.
Leviticus, when we get to the holiness code, 19, right? Kedoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy, and it's addressing the whole community. There are a number of times with the entire community. But even the censuses in the book of Numbers that are taken, where they're trying to, the purpose of the census, among other things, but primarily is to see what kind of army they can muster as they're getting ready to go into the land of Israel. This is to see, this was counting, they weren't like the modern Israeli army, the women didn't serve.
But the question is, did women get Hansen's disease or the leprosy and how were they treated?
Right,
Miriam had it. Miriam had it.
Well, Miriam had something. Miriam, when and it does connect to this week's parsha, we're going to get to it. When Miriam speaks ill, not of her brother, but of her brother's wife, right? Dissing the in-laws, right? How common is this in family, right? They fetch about Moses' brother and sister are fetching about their sister-in-law. And by the way, it's a racial bias. She's a Cushite, and she's dark. And they, among other things, they don't like that. So they're dissing their sister-in-law, and she gets stricken. Yeah, this is not this week's parsha. We're not going to go into it, but you have to ask why Aaron doesn't get stricken. But she gets stricken with something that seems the same or similar to what's in this week's parsha, but it's actually, I don't think it's ever called that exactly. So who knows what it was? To answer your question about did women get this, we don't know. This is an argument from silence. So how can we possibly know? I think there's every reason to expect that if men could get it, women could get it. I don't know that there's a lot of diseases that are sex-linked. Pregnancy is not a disease, but that's at least a physical state that can happen to women and not men.
Prostate cancer is.
Prostate cancer, thank you.
Suppose uterine
So
cancer.
I think this is just an example of a patriarchal text and so on. So, but there's an elaborate ritual with as I say, a right side bias. And then I want to get to 21. This is the whole reason I wanted to get into this. If, however, he is poor and his means are insufficient, he shall take one male lamb for a reparation offering to be elevated in expiation, 1/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil, 2 turtle doves, 2 pigeons, and so on. What do we see going on here? I think something very interesting and important.
That they consider they consider your financial situation.
There has to be some way. So, yeah,
Also, that the disease is caused by his sin, expiation.
right. We're gonna get to that and just hold that thought for a minute, because it's a very troubling part of the Parsha. And kind of Torah medicine in general, I would say biblical medicine in general, and attitudes towards it. But here, there's some recognition of socioeconomic differences, and that treatment for disease has to be available not only for those who can buy whatever animals they need, but for those who don't have the resources. And I just think in terms of access to healthcare, if we want to take Torah, make it and keep it a living document, how does it guide our lives? Not, 2,500, 3,000 years ago. How does it guide our lives and the way we structure society now, right? Either because we want to follow what's in the Torah, or because we find something objectionable and we want to respond to it and change it. But by keeping it a living document, we have to see here that it's saying access to some kind of health care has to be provided irrespective of your socioeconomic
First Medicare.
economic needs.
Medicare.
Well, right, actually Medicaid, I think, would be, right? But here's what it doesn't tell me. I've been thinking about this all week. I haven't come up with an answer. And I've done a little snooping around and I didn't find anything that helped me. Which is what it doesn't. So instead of having to bring, animals, which are obviously more expensive than birds, I mean, turtle doves. If anybody's a birder here, I don't want to insult you or upset you, but we're talking pigeons here, yes, right? If you couldn't afford, mammals, you could bring pigeons, you could bring turtle doves, and much less expensive. But what it doesn't tell us is, what about if you couldn't even afford that? In other words, what about for those that are impoverished but destitute? And I don't know what the answer is. I raise it as a question. The Torah doesn't tell us.
Maybe
Here's what I'd like to
they're
think.
too poor to sin.
Too poor to sin. That's an interesting idea.
I think they will come in empty-handed and still ask for
So
forgiveness.
here's where I went with it, based on nothing but my own, and my wife will be the first to tell you this is rare that I do this, but just out of my own sense of idealism and hope, which is, we might interpret this to mean that it's saying if you're poor and you can't afford the regular, we have a substitute, less expensive. If you can't afford that, perhaps there was some kind of communal responsibility that your community had to provide you with the birds and the doves necessary, right? And for much of Jewish history, we lived tribally, and maybe from your tribe there was some obligation. Two comments, yes.
Yeah, I was thinking, so many people are bringing so many things for sacrifice that I'm sure the Kohanim probably have saved up some of these for the people who would not otherwise be able to.
That's a good
An
idea.
interesting idea, kind of a turtle dove bank.
You're always obligated to give charity no matter how poor you are. Now, of course, this is a modern idea. But you always have to give something. So they're basically saying you have to bring something, even if it's a cup of grass from your
Right,
yard.
right.
To show, besides, you're trying to atone and come empty-handed.
So the baby boomers in the room, along with me, and that's, I think, most of us in this room, might appreciate and might even remember, there was an Arlo Guthrie song about the last guy, right? People say, you know, if you're down on your luck, if you're having trouble, somebody will always point out, yeah, but look at this guy, he's got it worse than you. Look at this guy worse than you. He says, what about the last guy, right? His life is so bad, he can't even, this is what Arlo says, he can't even find a truck to run him over, right? That's how bad his life is. That's what makes me think about it. So I think what we can get from this, yes, Barry.
I'm just thinking about like when our families lived in the shtetls and came here 130 years ago or whatever, 100, more than half of them were unemployed. So they lived in like abject poverty. And they were very connected to Jewish life and they lived in these enclosed
Right.
Jewish communities. How did they apply this, or how did things work? Was there any relation? How did they relate to this in the Torah?
Well, I mean, one of the ways, there's some remnants of it left in our community, right? The whole reason we have a Hebrew Free Loan Society or association comes out of this era, that this was a self-help, you know, in a community-wide self-help that provided for people. And part of the reason it was set up as loans, well, there certainly were grants given, it was set up as loans is to provide, to protect human dignity, right? In other words, so you were given money to help you survive with the understanding that, you know, as you were able to, you would pay it back and then the next person would use it. There have been throughout Jewish history, I mean, we know in Jewish communal life throughout the Middle Ages and even into modern times, there were, what's that?
The Hebrew burial.
The burial society is another example, right? Which took care of, which still takes care of you at no cost. But there were communal institutions created and the community functioned in some ways as a kind of a corporate entity which looked out for everybody. Now, does that mean there was no poverty? This is part of the problem with Fiddler on the Roof being so popular is first of all, it's an idealized view of shtetl life. And secondly, it makes poverty in some ways look very glamorous, right? What's the old joke, right? I've been poor and I've been rich. Rich is better, you know. But there were communal institutions, but as you say, a lot of what happened in that era, I mean, this is true for lots of immigrant communities, is that families took care of one another. And so they literally took people in and, you know, lots of stories of, you know, in a small tenement apartment, all of a sudden there's an aunt and uncle and two cousins living with you for, you know, a half a year or longer. Sometimes this was done better, sometimes not as well. Sheila and then
Well,
Bijan.
if you think about it, one of the things, if you're a development director, is we want you to give something, even if it's $1, penny or something, we want to be able to list you. In other words, that indicates that you're part of us.
Yeah, I appreciate that, but and that's nice. That's good and it's nice, and I agree with you. But let's just be pragmatic enough to say they'd rather have you give $1 than a penny. Bijan.
No, but the point is.
I understand. I understand. Bijan.
It seems to me that the idea of the Jewish ghetto comes from the sense that some communities, we're talking about the Jewish community, had this feeling and this notion that we need to be close to each other, we need to be nearby each other and form cohesive communities to help each other financially and many other ways. And in fact, the idea of the Jewish ghetto, even though the word ghetto is a probably German, European language, but it was the exact same idea and the exact same thing in many other non-European countries.
Right.
They were not called ghettos, but it was an actual Jewish ghetto.
Right. Well, I mean, there's an interesting history to all of this because in some ways the ghettoization of the Jews was forced upon us. On the other hand, We know that lots of ethnic, cultural, religious groups like to live amongst themselves. And so even when we're not ghettoized, Cleveland's a very good example of this. It's changing now. But, you know, if you look at Cleveland post-World War II, for about 50 years, almost the entire Jewish community was in the eastern suburbs, right? And we in fact did impose, in some ways, a self-ghettoization. I don't mean that to be derogatory anyway. But it was, you know, it was all the Heights and then Beechwood and, you know, little by little, we kept moving east. But, why did we do that? Why didn't our community spread out more, right? We like to be near each other.
Walking distance to the synagogue.
Well, that's only for some Jews.
Right.
That's not.
That's how it started.
Well, yeah, that's why people live near synagogues, but any small community, you don't have to live all near each other. You just need enough people to live near a synagogue to support that synagogue. You don't need to all be near each other, and certainly for Reform and conservative Jews for the past 70 or 80 years, where driving on Shabbat has not really been an issue for the most part.
Why we spread out.
Right, so, you know, that doesn't really explain it, that you need to be near the synagogue. That's not the case anymore. I want to keep going. We're not going to get to, we're more comfortable, right? I would just say, to go back to Barry, your comment, your question about, you know, how was this represented? Of course, the Jewish Federation system, with the money it raises and distributes in the community, they would claim, and I think with a certain legitimacy, that they actually are the descendants, right, of earlier parts of the Jewish world in which we tried to provide for everyone's needs. And our community does a self-study and they never want to call it a census, but what do we call it? A population survey or study, but it's a census. They do that in order to determine what the communal needs are and where we need to shift resources, right? It's one of the reasons this community puts so much money into Jewish education. Here's what's going to happen, by the way. This is my not very bold prediction. We know that the percentage of the Orthodox community, the percentage of the Jewish community that is Orthodox is increasing, both because of lower birth rates among the non-Orthodox than in the Orthodox world, and also because of people becoming more observant and getting it connected to the Orthodox community, more so than perhaps in Reform and conservative circles. We are going to see, certainly in our children and grandchildren's lifetime, a tremendous shift of resources. And while significant amounts of money in this community, I'm talking about here in Cleveland, is given to all kinds of organizations and will continue to be, without a doubt, you will see, you know, 30, 40 years from now, you'll see a much greater proportion of it will be going to Orthodox communities and synagogues and schools, because they're going to make the case that this is where the people are. And it's going to be a valid case they're going to make. And they're going to say, we're doing more intensive, they're already saying it, we're doing more intensive Jewish education than anybody else is. Fund this for our children. And we're sending more people to Israel and blah, and we're already beginning to see this. But you will see tremendous shift of communal dollars. Yeah.
Any comments about this, I guess, relatively recent change where some of these Jewish institutions that were handled by the Federation were turned over to profit-making organizations? You kind of, how will that affect what you're talking about?
You know, I've been a rabbi in the community a long time. I do not dwell at the upper echelons of Federation life. Some of you in the room, you know, I mean, you have the head of the Federation here in your synagogue, and her husband is your rabbi. But I don't get to sit in on those meetings. I run a small little, you know, side operation. But I remain a bit baffled about the inability of the Jewish community to hold on to a Jewish nursing home. And but you know, my first job when I came to Cleveland, we moved here from my wife to go to medical school. We committed to come to Cleveland before I had a job, which with 2 children was maybe a little irresponsible to them. But my first job, it was part of the Montefiore move from Mayfield and Lee up to Beechwood. And it was an expansion of services. And they had always had rabbis that came in and did things, but they hired a rabbi full-time on staff. I was the first rabbi to have that position. And largely because expanding services and a short-term unit and a hospice program and so on. You know, what is the Maltz Hospice used to be the NCJW Montefiore Hospice. And so that was my first position here in Cleveland. So I have a certain affection for Montefiore Home of blessed memory now. How this community, got to the point where we now don't have a Jewish nursing home. Just as I qualify for Medicare, makes me very unhappy. So, so I don't know how to answer you because it concerns me. I think that and the consolidation of the two large Reform synagogues, which God willing will go successfully. I'm not sure what's that. Well, I'm outside a hospital. Now you're going back a generation practically. So, all right, I got to keep moving here because I got things I want to get to, and we're really going to run out of time. So that's the idea in terms of communal responsibility for everyone. Now, I want to talk about this illness part. Illness, in other words, why do you go to the priest in order to be cured of this affliction, right? Because we want to be healthy, because healthy is a better state, not just physically, but psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. Healthy is a better state than illness. I mean, disease, right? Just break the word apart. Dis-ease isn't just about physical state of being, but much more than that, right? And the traditional commentary in terms of the two plants that are taken, the part of the cedar tree, part of the hyssop, is that the cedar tree is kind of the tallest. It's the lion of the jungle. The cedar tree is the flora. No, which is which? Flora or fauna?
Flora is
Flora,
life.
right? Flora, right? The hyssop. The cedar is the flora. Is the lion of the flora world, and the hyssop is a lowly little nothing. The cedar is tall and strong. The hyssop is small and vulnerable. The commentary is that we take from both in recognition of the illness state that we're trying to remove ourselves from. Illness, and one of the things I do 8 to 10 hours a week is chaplaincy for Jewish patients at Cleveland Clinic main campus. And I've been doing this for a long time. I actually started as the floater for the Federation. And then when Rabbi Schachter could no longer do it, then I took over, but that's 10, 12 years ago at least. And so I'm in and out of the hospital all the time. And what I've experienced is what all of you already know, which is that illness is can be very lonely and alienating. Yeah. We feel disconnected from people. We feel very exposed. There's nothing better than a hospital gown to give you a sense of exposure, not just in that case, physical, not psychological, but physical exposure. And out of an attempt in the Jewish world to assist and help those who are ill, in a sense, all of us becoming priests, in the sense of the biblical priests, right? And we are called, not just the holy people, but a kingdom of priests. In becoming like priests, out of that develops the mitzvah of Bikor Cholim, visiting the sick. And I want to read a story from the Talmud, from Brachot. It's a classic rabbinic story. Some of you may be familiar with it. The Gemara continues to address the issue of suffering and affliction. Brachot 5b. Rabbi Yochanan's student, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, fell ill. Right? So Chia bar Abba gets sick. Rabbi Yochanan entered to visit him and said to him, "Is your suffering dear to you? Do you desire to be ill and afflicted?" Let's stop right there. This is a crazy question to ask, but it's not. Why does Yochanan ask his student, "Is your suffering dear to you?" what's he getting at?
You have mental problem, you have other issues outside,
Oh.
inferring some kind of family problem, mental problem.
Maybe, I'm not gonna say that's not it, but I don't think that's it.
Could
Yes,
it be another way to say, did you bring this on yourself? You know, by like not taking care or,
well, if you're suffering dear to you, do you desire to be ill and afflicted? Perhaps that's what it means, but actually, I don't think
Okay.
that's what it's getting at either, yeah.
sometimes there's meaning in suffering.
Aha,
So maybe this person has reflected on their suffering and it is dear to, meaning it's important to them that they go through this.
right, that is that's the nicest gloss. The idea of meaning and suffering
Silver
is
lining.
correct. But you're putting to me, what is the nicest spin on it? Because what we find in biblical and rabbinic literature, it looks like we're about to get many young students, but we're not coming in. Is an idea that today, I'm not sure has quite the currency that it historically has had. By the way, this is not unique to Judaism, which is the notion that suffering is redemptive. In other words, that the meaning in suffering, you went in a different direction with it, which is, I think, a good direction and a better and a psychologically a healthier direction. But I think what the Yochanan is asking is, is this part of your redemption?
Yeah.
Perhaps for something you've done related to the idea of you brought it on yourself, right? It kind of ties us into the other. Is suffering, this, by the way, is in my opinion, not a terribly healthy, psychologically, spiritually healthy orientation. We might learn something from suffering. But the idea that it's somehow redemptive and therefore it justifies our suffering or says it makes it a good thing, right? That I find to be a deplorable idea and not terribly helpful. It's related to the idea, you hear people say this and it makes me crazy. And I try not to jump out of my seat and strangle them, right? When somebody says to somebody who's experienced a terrible loss or has had some traumatic experience, right? This is it. Makes me nuts. God never gives you more than you can handle. Well, first of all, God, in my opinion, God doesn't give us these things to begin with. So right away, we've derailed any kind of theology that I want to connect myself to. But it's also just not true.
Right.
Because if it were true, right, and forget about God doesn't give us more than we can handle. If it were true that no one ever, whatever the forces of the universe, that no one ever got more than they could handle, we'd have no illness. We'd have no addiction. We'd have no mental illness. And the fact that people's lives completely unravel and they wind up, with some kind of addiction, just as the most obvious, easiest example, is evidence that in fact, lots of people have more than they can handle.
Yeah.
Right? And my first position out of rabbinical school, I was the Hillel rabbi at Ohio University. And, there's above and beyond the students, there's a small Jewish community there and lots of mixed married couples and a very comfortable place for interfaith couples to often go. It was to Unitarian fellowships. Some of them call themselves Unitarian churches, some are Unitarian fellowships. And the Unitarian Fellowship in Athens used to have a Seder every year. Not necessarily first or second night, but sometimes usually the Sunday during the holiday, they had a Seder in the afternoon. And partly because there were a lot of Jews in that Unitarian Fellowship. And it was a nice group of people. They invited me to the Seder, my first or second year there. And not to lead it, but to just be a participant. So, I was game, so I went and heard one of the most powerful stories I ever heard. I've always been very glad that I went. They had pre-assigned parts of the Seder to different people for them to bring something in to share, connected to that part of the Seder or to teach. And when we got to the part about in every generation, each of us should feel like we ourselves were liberated from slavery, right? That's a hard thing to do when we live most of our lives pretty comfortably, right? In lots of different ways. We look around in our lives and we see many more things that are blessings than that are hardships.
But it's the idea that matters.
What's that?
It is the idea.
For sure, no argument there. But the gentleman that was assigned this section got up and talked about becoming sober. And he said, you know, for much of my adult life, and this is how he said it, I was a slave to the bottle. I was enslaved in my whiskey bottle. And he had been sober at that point for, I don't know, 10, 12 years, whatever, you know, reasonably long time, but not forever. And it was very moving to hear that he really felt like he had been liberated from something that enslaved him. Absolutely, for him was a kind of slavery, and it caused all kinds of problems. Okay. So this is Yochanan's question, I think, is what he's getting at. Is your suffering dear to you? Do you desire to be afflicted? And Chia says, Lo hen velo sacharan. I welcome neither the suffering nor its reward. See, I think he's saying to him, shut up with your redemptive talk, right? That whatever reward there is in this suffering, I have no interest in it. I don't desire it. In other words, I think Chia is rejecting this idea of suffering is redemptive. As one, I welcome neither this suffering nor its reward, as one who welcomes the suffering with love is rewarded. Rabbi Yochanan said to him, give me your hand. Rabbi Chia bar Abba gave him his hand, and Rabbi Yochanan stood him up and restored him to health. He had
So he was willing to be.
He was what?
He was willing to be cured because he gave him his hand.
He gave him his hand. And Yochanan appeared to have, whether it was just that act itself, or perhaps he had some kind of, I don't want to say special powers, but some kind of depth of spirit that just in doing this, he reached out and he was able to get him up out of his sickbed.
Can I
Yeah,
say something?
and then we have to get to the end here, yeah.
Which is, if he were, say, burdened by guilt of some sort, the man who got ill, he might have been looking for a way to expiate. But he wasn't, maybe he felt free of sin, so he didn't need to.
Okay, right, but this reaching out, which is a physical act, right? Somehow communicated and allowed something, but let's go and allowed something to happen. Let's go. Similarly, Rabbi Yochanan fell ill. Okay, so now the healer
Is ill.
Right.
I don't want to insult anybody, but some of you know that, that doctors are very often the worst patients, right? This is what we're gonna have. Not always true. But part of why that's true, this is my experience out of doing chaplaincy work for 15 years for the Federation, is that one of the reasons that is true, and it's true for doctors, but also true for other people that work in nurses and other medical personnel, they have a greater fund of knowledge. And so they understand the risks much more, and they understand the seriousness and potential seriousness, right? So they're thinking in their heads about stuff that most of us don't even think about, but they're already like 3 or 4 complications down the road. And that knowledge actually can sometimes make it harder to heal, right? Just, that just depends on the individual. But okay, the healer gets sick. Rabbi Yochanan fell ill. Rabbi Hanina entered to visit him. Okay, now the guy who he
Cured.
Got out of bed comes to him and said to him, is your suffering dear to you? Rabbi Yochanan said to him, I welcome neither this suffering nor its reward. Right, gives the same answer. Rabbi Hanina said to him, give me your hand. He gave him his hand, and Rabbi Hanina stood him up and restored him to health. Now, out of this and other stories like it, but out of this comes the idea, and you've probably heard this, that the mitzvah of Bikor Cholim, of visiting the sick, the tradition is that when you visit someone who is ill, you relieve 1/60th of their suffering. Now, there's always a bar mitzvah kid in the class who says, so then you mean if 60 people visited him, he would be well? That's not what it means, right? But the idea that
Think about the Nitra Berach prayer, if you're thinking of someone,
right,
If you make a call, ready is like a dose of medicine. It's
Right.
equal to one aspirin, whatever, but it's.
Find the West Wing episode. West Wing is on, I forget which of the streaming services. Find the West Wing episode, which addresses, among other things, intercessory prayer. Prayer on behalf of someone else.
Yes.
It's related to your point, Jim.
Especially nowadays.
So, okay, so Rabbi Hanina restores Yochanan to good health. Now, but here's the coda to the story. The Gemara asks, why did Rabbi Yochanan wait for Rabbi Hanina to restore him to health? If he was able to heal his student, let Rabbi Yochanan stand himself up. And the Gemara answers, a prisoner cannot generally free himself from prison.
Very nice.
So it depends on others to release him from his shackle. Right? In other words, when you're ill, even if you have the ability to heal others, right? When you're ill, you need others to help you. I mean, it is very communal oriented in this regard. Okay. I read recently, some of you may have read it, it's been out a few years, Salika Jawad's Between Two Kingdoms. Anybody read this? I highly recommend it. It is an upsetting book because she's a young woman and she is diagnosed with, I think, a lymphoma in college and nearly dies. Salika Jawad was a journalist and a writer, and she was wound up writing a blog all through her illness. Wound up writing a blog for the New York Times, and hundreds of people wrote to her, responded online and in personal letters. She, by the way, she's a fabulous writer. Her husband is the prodigy pianist, John Batiste.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so Salika Jawad went through this illness, and the first half of the book is about coping with this illness. And she was a young woman. She was in college when it started. It started with an itching. And eventually she was diagnosed, I believe it was a lymphoma. And she's treated and she healed. Now, she actually, when this book came out, she had a reoccurrence, and she's been treated again and seems to be doing okay. Now I think she's around 30, 31. She's more or less my son's age, my youngest. But the first half of the book is about coming through the illness and what it was like to be a cancer patient, particularly at a very young age, and a child of immigrants. And the second half of the book, after she recovered and was essentially in, I don't know if they called it remission, but essentially was disease-free, she decided to do a cross-country trip by car and visited the second half of the book's about 8 or 10 people that she visited, people that had written to her, who had been ill and who had written to her. And she went and visited them, and she went all across the country. And the book is called Between Two Kingdoms. And she explains right in the beginning of the book that the title, some of you may be familiar with where the title comes from, Between Two Kingdoms. In 1978, Susan Sontag wrote a book called Illness as Metaphor. It's actually not a whole book. It's a long essay. So I decided, since Salika Jawad references this and for the title of the book, that I should read that. So I just actually finished it this week. And at the very beginning of Sontag's essay, she says, all of us hold passports to two kingdoms, the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the ill.
Interesting.
And we move between these two kingdoms at different points in our life. She wrote this, by the way, while she was under treatment for a cancer. I'm not even sure what kind of cancer it was. I don't even remember if she says in the book, but Susan Sontag was under cancer treatment. It's been reprinted a number of times. It's a long essay, and that was in 1978. And about 10, 12 years later, after the AIDS epidemic had swept through the country and was very vibrant, was kind of at the beginning of good treatments for HIV, she wrote AIDS and its Metaphors, the second essay, and now the two of them are generally printed together. But she says, right, we hold passports to two kingdoms.
Interesting.
The kingdom of the well, the kingdom of the ill. Let me shift gears if I can for just, I have 5 minutes left. Let me use them efficiently. The more traditional interpretation of Mitzorah, because there's not a lot of Hansen's disease in our synagogues these days, right? And I don't know if, I know that certain classic diseases that were more or less either eradicated or nearly eradicated would be a better way to put it, are on the ascendancy in certain parts of the world, right? I think this is true for tuberculosis, if I'm not mistaken.
Measles.
Polio.
Measles came back.
I don't know if this is true for Hansen's disease.
No.
But because it's not so relevant to our everyday lives, and even by the rabbinic period wasn't so relevant, right? I mean, I'm talking the kind of 1st through 5th centuries CE. The rabbis interpreted Mitzorah, they always loved a little wordplay, to Motzi Ra.
Yeah.
Motzi, to bring out, Ra, evil. To bring out evil, what are they talking about?
Lashon hara.
Lashon hara, evil speech, right? The Motzi Ra, the Mitzorah, the Motzi Ra was associated with elsewhere in the Torah, where we're told, do not be a talebearer amongst your people. Don't go about gossiping. I don't know if I can hear it. Don't go around gossiping and telling tale. Now, if you've ever been subject to any kind of in workplace, in the law, and in whatever setting, friendships, if you've ever been accused of, if you've ever been falsely accused of doing or saying something that you didn't say or do, you have an immediate visceral reaction to this, because that's a very difficult position to be in. And often you have to kind of prove your innocence from nothing, because you didn't do what you're accused of. So how can you prove you didn't do it, right? But it goes well beyond that. Right? Gossip, the classic teaching is, we downplay it today, that gossip injures 3 people. But actually, that's not the rabbinic quote. You know what the rabbinic quote is? Gossip kills 3 people. They equated gossip with murder.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the idea of character assassination. That's a nice way to phrase it and to think about it. Character assassination, where things are being said about you. 3 people are injured, right? It's not very hard to figure out. The 3 are the gossiper, the person who hears the gossip, and the subject of the gossip. These 3 people are injured. And what's particularly important about character assassination, false accusation, that kind of that category or that effect of gossip, is that it can have it can do lasting damage to reputation.
Yeah.
Because once heard, it stays in people's minds, no matter how untrue it is. West Wing also quotes, I think it was Mark Twain. No, it's not West Wing, it's Sorkin's other show, Studio 60, where Ed Asner, who plays a character, a news executive, quotes Mark Twain and says, right, that a lie can travel around the world while the truth is still putting its pants on.
Yeah.
I want to just very quickly I have 2 minutes?
Yes.
Very generous. Now let me get to page 703 and 704 here. This is from Sefer Haggadah, a book of collected midrashim that was put out by Bialik and Rabnitsky. They collected midrashim from all across the Jewish genres, and they printed it and wrote it in Hebrew, and then after I was ordained, an English translation of it came out. It's much quicker and easier to use, to be honest. Here we are. Rabbi Eliezer ben Jacob said, when a handsome, and so now we're talking about language. Here, they're not talking so much about just straight up gossip, though it's included. Here, they're talking about vulgar speech. Now, we might see vulgar speech to be, in some ways, a form of Lashon Hara. In fact, it is. Gross, insensitive, vulgar speech. When a handsome and distinguished man allows an unseemly word to issue from his mouth, what is he like? A large and well-appointed dining hall with a tanner's ill-smelling drain pipe running through its middle. I love that because it's an olfactory image, right? That you don't feel that, you smell this midrash, right? That's what I love about it. You smell this midrash. Now there's another one. That's not the one I wanted. Yes. Rabbi Hanan Bar Chava said, all know why a bride enters the bridal chamber. Right? So the bridal chamber, that's where the bride and groom went on their wedding night. This would be the first time they would have intimate relations. All know why a bride enters the bridal chamber, yet when a man speaks obscenely of it, and a very wise professor taught me many years ago, whenever literature, particularly biblical rabbinic literature in our tradition, says not to do something or references something that shouldn't be done, why does it tell us that? People were doing it.
Yeah.
But a man speaks obscenely of it, even if a decree of 70 years happiness has been sealed for him, it is reversed into 70 years of misery. Right? Because to speak obscenely about what went on in the bridal chamber, at the very least, would embarrass the bride. And to embarrass another person. Why? And this is why the rabbis equated gossip with murder. Because what happens if you're gossiped about and you find out about it? If someone says something to you, right? Two things typically can happen. One, you could become embarrassed and your face would turn red. All the blood is rushing to your face. And the rabbi said, gossip, it's like drawing blood.
Yeah.
Conversely, you might hear something about yourself, and in shock, what might happen? You turn ghost white. All the blood rushes out of you, right? And out of your face. In other words, again, this is a withdrawal of blood. So whether we're drawing blood or taking the blood away, we equate gossip with murder. I'm thinking that's an odd note to end on. Let me see if I have one more. End there. That's a very odd note. Contrary to my time spent with you this morning, I'll share this one. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, I spent all my life among sages and found nothing better for a person than silence. He who talks too much brings on sin. I hope I haven't done that. Shalom. Chag Sameach to everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. You should have what I call a kosher enough Pesach. That way you can find your own balance.